Welcome everybody to this presentation on standardization. My name is Signe Annette Boegh. I am a senior project manager in Danish Standards. I've been here for 13 years now, so hopefully I know just a little bit about standardization. My main responsibility is working with research and innovation. I work mainly on the European level, so that means that I am also a partner in several framework programs. I've been working with Horizon Europe, Horizon 2020, FP7. So I have also seen this from the other side of the table about how it is to work in research and innovation. Today, I am here representing a project called HSbooster, which has the purpose of linking research, innovation, and standardization in a better way. And I will let you know in a second why it is that the Commission has started this particular project. These are my contact details. Feel free to contact me at any time, and then I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have. And I can just also state that my background is in engineering, so I also have some technical background. So, first of all, what is it we are going to talk about today? This is the first of 3 webinars we're going to be having for the ELMS projects. The agenda of today is, what is it a standard is? Some of you might already know, but we don't have a patent on the word standard. So that means I would like to just let you know what it is that I mean when I'm talking about standards. Why is it then that standardization is so relevant for research and innovation? I'm also going to be talking about how can then, in more practical terms, standardization be included in projects. I also have some examples of different standardization committees that I think might be relevant for your projects to know about. And then finally, one of my favorite points is, how do I find the right standard? Because I can tell you that, for example, if you look in Danish Standards web shop, then we have 36,000 documents. So that means sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of help on how you're going to find the right standard. I can already now also mention that we have 2 more webinars coming up. The next one is on the 9th of October, where we're going to be talking a little bit about CE marking of products. As some of you know, then if you are developing in particular medical devices or robots or things like that for the European market, then you need to CE mark your product if you want it to go to market. So we have a small session of 1 hour on that. Then on the 30th of October, we also have another session, which is going to be about life cycle assessment and how you can use standards for this. Just very quickly, HSbooster, like I said, that is what I am representing here today. This is a coordination and support action where we are trying to find the best method of how we can boost the link between research and innovation. So that's in the capacity that I'm here today. And I will also tell you a little bit about what are the other tools we have that might help you in your projects. But I like always starting from the beginning. So when I say standard, and you will hear me say this word quite a lot for the next hour, what is it exactly that I mean? I have an example there in the picture of what a standard looks like. They all look more or less the same. So once you start recognizing the front cover, then you'll know this is what we call a formal standard. Formal standards are developed in the national standardization organizations, such as Danish Standards. It could also be NEN in the Netherlands, UNI in Italy, DIN in Germany, and so on. Each country in Europe has this formal national standardization body. Most of these standards are going to be either European or international, because we're developed them also to make sure that, for example, new innovations can go to market. So what is a standard? First of all, it's what we call a technical document. It can also be, for example, a methodology. It can be a test. It can be many different forms. But it has to have some sort of context that's explaining how something can be done or should be done. It's voluntary, and this is also something that's very important for me to stress, because many people often confuse standardization with legislation. And even though they are heavily linked, which you will hear more about at the next webinar on CE marking, then they are still voluntary. They're used to give rules, guidelines, or definitions, and they are consensus built. Consensus means that we have a lot of experts and stakeholders sitting around the table helping us draft these standards. And we have to reach consensus before we publish these standards. So that's a key for you to know, is what is in the standard is what we could reach an agreement upon. So it's consensus based. They should be repeatable, because it doesn't make sense to make these formal standards for only one use. So this is something that's for repeated use, and it's for doing something, basically. Like I said, I'm starting kind of with the beginning. So I have a first question for many of you. You can just raise your hand on the camera. Have any of you been to Greece? Yes? Did any of you ever see any pillars when you were there? So those nice little structures you see on the left? Yes? You can actually thank standardization because they're still there. Because this is a very good example of what standardization can be used for. In Greece, or in the Greek Empire, they loved to have these very nice looking pillars, often made of very expensive material. But they also had wars and earthquakes and things like that that destroyed these beautiful pillars. So what they found out was, if they make these pillars in sections and put this little pin in between, then, for example, if there was an earthquake, they would just rotate around the axis, and then they would still be standing afterwards. But of course, like people do today, many of the people building these little pins and pillars, they cheated. They wanted to make it in the most cheap way possible. So they made it of the wrong material. And then it didn't work. So what they actually did in the Greek Empire was that they chiseled in stone, and you can still see this at the museum in Greece. They chiseled what we call the first standard, where they defined what should be the properties of this pin if we want these pillars to last for a very long time. So that was actually one of the first standards that we have knowledge of. So standardization is not something new. It's something that has existed for many, many years, because it's made where we need some sort of method or test or likewise for how should we do something. So that was just a very short introduction about what is a standard. I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page. I can also state that if you look into a standard, then you will see there's always terminology written in a standard, because it's always important that we agree what is we're talking about. We have many new terms, like, for example, circular economy, where there can be doubts, what is it we mean with this particular word? And this you can find also in the standards. So why is standardization relevant for research and innovation? Oftentimes, people will think this is something that's only needed for well-established technologies, but this is very far from the truth. Actually, standardization is a key in making research and innovation work for society. The reason that I would like to discuss this with you today, we actually have one of the deputy directors of DG GROW, so from the Commission, who has stated these different aspects of why is it we should consider standardization in research innovation. She says, first of all, when you are working with innovations, especially groundbreaking technology, which is what you are doing in EIC, this is groundbreaking technology, make sure standardization is part of your project. Secondly, standards should be covered in research projects because this makes it supported by a broad base of stakeholders. So here you can also read that one of the reasons why you should be interested in standardization is so the technologies you're working on are actually supported by a broad base of society. And secondly, it's also about education, making sure that the next generations also know what is this tool and how can we use it. So going a little bit more in depth on what I'm saying here is, for example, we have right now in Europe and internationally more than 28,000 standards. So you can imagine the amount of brains it has taken to make all these documents. So there is a whole lot of knowledge you can find in already established standards. I can give a good example, actually from Denmark. We are very strong in developing medical equipment in Denmark. For example, we have these insulin pens, where we have been quite innovative. And this is this Danish company, very large company. Some of you might already know who they are. I'm not going to mention their name, but I'm sure some of you can guess, that have developed this insulin pen. And what they did to become first mover was actually that they looked into what technologies have already been described in standardizations and can we use them for this innovation. So they looked at all this technology and actually found some technologies in hearing aids and things like that that they could use for the development of the insulin pen. And that meant that they didn't have to invent the wheel twice. So they got a head start and made this insulin pen before anybody else in the market, and thereby got a really good head start. So there's a lot of knowledge that you can find in standardization if you know where to look for the right standard. We also have more than 1,000 what we call technical committees. Technical committees are where experts such as you sit around the table and develop the content for these standards. So we basically have tens of thousands of experts sitting around the world, making sure that we get the best possible standards. And one of the things that we are very focused on in the world of standardization is that we also want to make sure that the standards we're developing are innovation proof, so to speak. So that means that we have to make sure that not only old and established technology is standardized, but we also need to make sure that new technologies have a place in standards so we don't hinder innovation by making too strict standards. So that's quite key. Standards, they're also a very good way of supporting market access, especially if you're working with something that's groundbreaking. I have an example here. This is a project that Danish Standards is a partner in. It's called Easy Stress. What they're working on is to develop a method for non-destructive testing of metal. The reason why they're doing this is, of course, they want to make sure that we can have metal structures that have as long a life as possible. Because oftentimes, for example, if you have a metal pin or something like that, you just replace it on a continuous basis because you want to make sure that it doesn't break. But by using this technology, you can actually measure the stress in the metal to make sure that you only replace it when needed. So this is a good way to save material. The issue was that this technology was very well known at universities, but nobody basically outside the universities knew about this methodology. So what we are doing in this project, and this is something that's going on right now, is we're taking this method for non-destructive testing of metal, and we're actually turning it into a standard. These standards, because this is a European standard, will be published in 34 European countries, where it's now accessible for industry. So if you have a new technology and you have to figure out how do I actually get this technology to market, then you definitely need to consider if this is something that should be standardized. Of course, there's both patents and standards, and they each have their roles in innovation. Patents are mostly if you want to protect your technology, But sometimes it's not enough to protect your technology. Sometimes you also need to make sure that there's trust in the market for your technology. And this is something you can do via standardization. So if you want to create trust and sort of spread out the technology, then you also need to consider standardization in your project. So those were some of the basic reasons why especially the Commission right now are pushing for this better link between research, innovation, and standardization. And I know it all sounds both fluffy and difficult. So I have also put a little bit of emphasis here on how is it then that we can actually include this in projects. In February this year, the Commission published a code of practice on standardization in research and innovation. You can find this online, or of course afterwards I will send out the slides and then there will be a link for it. This code of practice from the Commission has three main areas. It has one for higher education institution and R&I organizations. It has one for project partners, and it has one for policy and stakeholders. So those are the main chapters in this code of practice. I have put emphasis today on project partners because I thought that was most relevant for you as an audience. So what is it this Commission code of practice is telling us to do? First of all, when you are either developing a proposal or you are part of a research consortium already, you need to take a look at what is the standardization landscape that this project is existing in. Again, this is to make sure that you have a very good idea of what is the knowledge that could be relevant in my project. It could be, for example, for interoperability. It could also be a standard that can help you in regard to European legislation. Again, I'll not be talking so much about legislation today. That's for the next webinar. But I can tell you again, standardization is very closely linked to regulation in Europe. So if you are working in your project on also mapping regulation, then you should also be mapping standardization. Common knowledge to make a strategic position. Of course, standardization is not relevant for all projects, but you need to find out, is standardization relevant for my project? And you can only do this if you have sufficient knowledge about what is it that standardization can do in a project. And that's one of the reasons that I'm glad you're here, because that's something that I can help you with, is finding out what is it that we can actually do and what could our strategic position be on this. Involve partners with a standardization experience. This is, of course, mostly if you are doing a new proposal, then make sure you have somebody who knows about standardization in the proposal. Make standards a tangible part of the project. So that, of course, means that if possible, make sure this is something that is included in the different deliverables, and make sure that you are actually committed to the strategy that you'd find out is the best for this particular project. Stakeholder engagement. This is also actually a fun point that people don't necessarily think about in relation to standardization. But it is possible for you to join a standardization committee and be a part of this extremely big network that we have. So we actually often give the advice to research innovation projects. If you want to know what's going on, if you want to have a big network in this particular area, you should join standardization, because oftentimes there will be some experts both in industry and in the Commission or NGOs or whichever that could be of relevance of your project. So it's a very good way of networking, actually, and getting stakeholder engagement. Again, this is about, you need to make sure that if it is relevant to act on standardization in our project, then you should. and you should make outputs on it. And you should make sure that it's also part of the impact section. Could also be performance indicators and so on. There are many points, so I just skipped some of them because we only have 1 hour today. But I wanted to just add this one, point number 9 from this code of practice. Standardization is really something that you also use to ensure that sustainability is there also beyond the lifetime of the project. Because commonly, a Horizon project would be between 3 or 4 years. But then what happens after the project ends? We, of course, want to make sure that all these great research results that came out of the projects have a life beyond the project. So if you are able to get your research results into standardization, this is a really good way of ensuring that there is sustainability, and then these research and innovation results will have a life also after these projects ends. So this is a good way of ensuring that your results are not lost once the funding stops, but this is actually something that can live on for some while longer. I can tell you we have some very good standards, and some of them have actually been living for more than 40 years. So that means it's a good way of ensuring sustainability. And we also continuously update the standards we have. So that also means that a standard doesn't really grow old. We're continuously making sure that we do have the newest innovations in them. But we can, of course, only have the new innovations in standards if the people working in research innovation participate. So I have just included here a little bit about what could be relevant committees for you. I took a look at the list of projects, and I found just some of them because there are many, I can tell you, that are of relevance for living engineered materials. As mentioned before, a standardization committee is sort of a group of expert stakeholders that sit around a table or online and work on what should be the standard for something. This could be anything, basically. More or less anything is standardized. I can just give some examples here, if you can see on the camera, for example. The ball pen on these pens, ball pens, they are standardized. We have here the USB stick, which is actually quite interesting these days, because maybe some of you, since this cable is white, will recognize this as being an Apple product. And actually, one of the very few cases where standardization has been turned into law is actually this particular plug, which is called a lightning plug. Because we want, of course, to have a green Europe. So what happened is actually that Apple was unsure if they wanted to change into USB-C, which is the cable that all the other producers of telephones are using. But the Commission said it's a waste of resources if every time we get a new telephone, we also need a new cable. So we want it to be the same cable throughout Europe. So this plug is not standardized, but the USB-C is. USB-C is in the future going to be also the cable that will be used by Apple, because the Commission said this standard is going to be the one that we use in Europe. So now Apple also needs to change their plugs to fit the standard of Europe. So there is actually many reasons for why you should be considering standardization. I have, again, just some examples here of what could be relevant for you. For example, ISO, I can just quickly tell you also, ISO is the International Standardization Organization. So that means that they are making international standards. TC stands for Technical Committee. So those are the committees that I've been mentioning a few times now that are developing the standards. We have one here, for example, 194. that's called Biological and Clinical Evaluation of Medical Devices. This one is, for example, key if you're working with implants. I'm actually right now in dialogue with a project that's quite interesting. They're 3D printing bone. So this implant is actually quite interesting, and we're going to be looking into what standardization is going on in this particular committee, because that's very relevant for this particular project on printing 3D bone. We also have one here. This one is about circular economy for textiles. As you all know, then textiles is a huge problem in regard to making a green economy. So now we're working on how can we develop standards that can make sure that we can actually recycle, or at least, or even better, create a circular economy on textiles. As mentioned, you're going to get this presentation afterwards, so you don't have to note down any numbers, you will get it afterwards. Oh, and I just forgot to say here, here it says CEN, TC. CEN is the European Standardization Organization. And WG, that stands for Working Group. So ISO is the international one, and CEN is the European one. We also can look beyond Europe, because sometimes when working with research innovation, we cannot be sure that something is actually happening right now in Europe, and then it can be a good idea to look abroad. ASTM, that's an American standardization organization. They have a committee that's working with industrial biotechnology and synthetic biology. So again, don't limit yourself to only Europe. Look beyond, because there can be something interesting going on beyond our own borders. We also have on additive manufacturing. So for example, if you are working with bioprinting, 3D printing, and so on, it can be a good idea to take a look what's going on in additive manufacturing, because most likely you'll find something interesting in this particular technical committee. We have also an ISO committee here on biotechnology. We have on microbiology of the food chain. So if you're working with food stuff, this one can be interesting for you. AI. There is a lot, I can tell you, going on in AI standardization, as you can imagine right now. And this is actually something I would say is very critical when you're working in European research. Because right now we are in standardization, we are trying to make sure that the viewpoints we have from Europe on AI is actually also reflected in the international standardization. Because sometimes in standardization, there can be different stakeholders with different viewpoints. And that means that sometimes there is a lot of negotiation going on in standardization. And AI is an example of where we have a lot of negotiation going on because we try to represent the European stakeholders in the particular committee. CENELEC is also a European Standardization Committee. JTC stands for Joint Technical Committee. So that means that this is CEN and CENELEC cooperating on making this particular committee. We have one on robotics. We have also one on bio-based products. And then the final one I have here is on health informatics. This one is actually quite hot these days, I would say, because there is a lot of work being done in regard to data. For example, the European health data space, also on in regard to e-health. And one interesting discussion some of you might have heard about is how do we actually classify apps and wearable devices, like I have here a smartwatch. And this watch is, of course, mostly for fun. It can measure my pulse and my sleep, and it can tell me when my phone is ringing and so on, but it does not have any medicinal purposes. It's not a medical device. But right now, a lot of discussion and standardization is going on in regard to Should this watch be classified in the same way as a medical device, a wearable medical device, or should it not? We don't have the conclusion on this yet, but those are some of the discussions you, for example, would encounter when working with standardization. So I hope that I at least somewhat got it right in regard to finding the right committees for you. These are just examples. We have many more. Like mentioned before, we have more than 1,000 technical committees. So I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to find some that could be interesting for you. If you would like to see more about what's going on in these committees, because we don't have time for that today, I have put in some links here that you may follow. If you are looking for CEN and CENELEC, so that's European standardization, then I have put in a link here where you can find out what is going on in these standardization committees, what are existing standards, and just as importantly, which standards are they working on right now? Because you'll also be able to see what is being standardized now that's not finished. And that is, of course, often where you will find the most innovative solutions. We have the same for ISO, where you can go in and find out what's going on. You can only see the titles, I'm afraid, because if you want to have access to the standards, then they need to be purchased. This is something you can do via the national standard body. And some of you, I'm sure, will have access via your organizations, because many organizations already have access to these standards. If you're unsure, then try to ask within your organization if you already have access to standards. Otherwise, I can tell you, first of all, they're not very expensive. And then they will be an eligible cost in Horizon projects. So that means that if you have, for some reason, need to purchase the standard, then find out if you cannot have this covered by the project, because most often you will be able to do this. I would say oftentimes a standard doesn't cost more than 100 euros, so it's not so much. But here is where you can find out which are the relevant work programs and what is going on in those. So we have now arrived at, like I said, one of my favorite parts is how do I then actually find the standard that could be relevant for my particular project. I have some tips and tricks that I would like to tell you about here. First of all, this one is quite key. I don't know how many of you have actually come to contact with a standard, but I can tell you that the terminology is actually quite important. Because if you are reading a standard, then you will encounter these 4 words, and you need to know what is the meaning when I read this particular word. So I have just here, to make life a little bit easier for you, hopefully, written what is meant. If you are reading a standard and you encounter the word shall, that means this is a requirement in the standard. I have an example here. Medical gloves for single use shall not leak when tested. So that means they cannot in any way leak, they shall not leak. Then we have something that could be a recommendation. Then it'll say should. Here we have this standard should be used to specify coding requirements. So this is only a recommendation. You can also encounter the word may in a standard. This will be what we call a permission. An example here is for flat products, a round test piece may be used if a testing machine with an adequate capacity is not available. And finally, we have the possibility of doing something. Here, the word can will be used. When the strain rate can be controlled, a rate of 1% per minute shall be set and maintained throughout the test. So here you actually have a sentence which have both can and shall. So if it's a possibility then you shall do something. So if you encounter standards, just make sure that you read the text carefully, so you make sure that you are doing the right thing if you would like to follow them or know about what's going on in the particular standard. What does the title say? Some of you, again, might already be using standards. Some of you will hopefully look into standards after today. I just wanted to make sure that you understand what is it that actually you can read from looking at the title, because you can actually get a lot of information just by reading the title. The first thing you'll have when looking at a title is what's called a national prefix. That basically means this one DS, that stands for Danish Standards, so that's from Denmark. So this is the national prefix of Denmark, and that means that we have implemented this standard in Denmark. And what does implement mean? That basically means that we have put in a front cover in the national language, and we have made it available in the Danish web shop for standards. If, for example, you were in the UK, it would say BS. If you were in Finland, it would say SFS. And if you were in Germany, it would say DIN, and so on. Each country has their own national prefix. Even more importantly, EN, that's the European prefix. Here you can read this standard is European, but you can also read it's also international. And some of you might wonder, how come this standard is both European and international at the same time? That's because we have a rule in Europe that's actually quite key. Every single European standard must be implemented in European countries. Actually EU plus EFTA, so that means also Norway, UK, and so on. ISO is voluntary if we want to implement it or not. EN is not. So that means that, for example, this standard could be developed at an international level, but we want to make sure that this is implemented in Europe, so we adopt this standard to also be European. It's also linked to legislation, because like you will learn at the next webinar, then some of these EN standards are very closely linked to European regulation, in particular the directives. And this can only be done with the EN standards. So that's also another reason why we would want to, for example, adopt an international standard to be European. So it's both. Yes, we have a question, Barbara.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm a bit confused. So what do you mean that the ISO standard is voluntary, but the EU standard is not?
They're all voluntary, but it's voluntary if we want to implement them in the European countries. And implement, that only means that it should be accessible. Because these EN standards, you must be able to find them in every single EU plus EFTA country. So that means, for example, if you are located in, let's say, France, then you will be able to go to the web shop of AFNOR and find this standard. So this is sort of to make sure that we have these standards accessible in every single European or EFTA country. So that is what is meant. They're still voluntary to use. You don't have to use them. They're voluntary, but they have to be accessible. Then these standards, they have a number. Oftentimes this number is completely random. So you cannot really read anything by just having the number. But it's easier, of course, to find the standard if you know what is the number you're looking for. Many standards are also part of what we call a series. And this particular standard is part of a series. And then there will be a number and then slash or line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So here you can read that this particular standard is number 10 in a series which are focusing on the same topic. This final one is very important for you to know. This is the publication year. The reason why this is so important is that you will, by reading this number, know what was the last time this particular standard got changed. Because every time we either publish a new standard or change something in an existing standard, we'll get a new year. So this means that this particular standard was changed this year, the last time. And you always want to make sure when working with standards that you have the newest standards. So you have to look for the highest year. Sometimes you, for example, will encounter that it says in 1982. That does not mean that nobody has looked into the standard since 1982, because every 5 years we look at the standards and we find out should this standard be revised or not. If the answer is no, it should not, it is good as it is, then we publish it again with the same year. So that means that it can actually be called 1982 for 30, 40, 50 years if we do not change it. But if we decide this standard needs to be changed, then we will change the standard and we will also change the year. But always look for the standard with the highest number in the end, because that is going to be the one that is the current one. Then we have the name. This is what we call introduction. So that means the entire series of 10993, they are all about biological evaluation of medical devices. So if you look at this series and this number, then again, there'll be one called /1, /2, and so on. This is the series. This one is part 10. And this particular one is about tests for skin sensitization. This is the main element. So you have the introduction, this is the series, and then you have the main element, what this part 10 is about. Yes. So how do we then find the right standard? I have just used the Danish web shop. I will show you in a second how to use it, but you may use any national standard body's website. So if you prefer to search in French or so on, then you can look at the French standardization body AFNOR. And if you prefer German, then you can use DIN and so on, because every single national standard body will have their own web shop that you can use for searching. And it's important for me to say here, this is not for you to buy the standard necessarily, but this is for you to search for the standard, because we do have some really good search tools in these web shops that I think would be an advantage of you to take a look at. So first of all, these are, I guess, basic search tools or basic search ideas that you know from Google, many of them. I'll just let you know anyway. One of them is, for example, if you're looking for a standard, try different ways of spelling something. Something can be spelled with an S, something can be spelled with a C, and so on. Use more than one word, and that's really key. Use more than one word, because that will make your life a whole lot easier. See if you have any synonyms, and then use the different search tools that we have. And I'm just going to stop sharing my presentation, and I will go over to our website so I can show you how you can do it. So you should now be able to see the website of Danish Standards, where we can do some different searches. So this is just to give you an example of how you can optimize your search to make sure you find the right standard. So I'm first just going to say, I would like to find a standard for medical devices. So I'm just going to type this and do a search. Here you will see I have 828 products. I'll just change the language, sorry. There we go, English better. I have 828 products found. You can now imagine who wants to look through 800 plus of these to find out which is the right standard for me. So I go back to my search. I write medical device. But I can also, for example, say, I would actually like to see something about some tests. So here I add a word saying medical devices test. I do a search again. Now I have 193 products found. It's a little better, but still not enough. So let's add another word. Let's just say, okay, what I'm actually looking for is a biological test. So medical devices, biological test. Let's do a search. Now I have 61 products I have found. So that's already, by adding more words, taking you from 800 standards to 61. In the Danish webshop, we also have these different search tools that I recommend that you can also use. For example, if, let's say, I'm looking for a standard that is linked to European legislation, then I can press this one. I can press harmonized, and fear not, again, at the next one about CE marking, you will get to know more what is harmonized, but it basically means that this particular standard is linked to European legislation. That's what harmonized means very briefly. Now I have 2 products. So that means that now it's very easy for me to find out which of these standards was it I was looking for. So was it irritation or sensitization that I was looking for? So by doing the search in the right way, you can go from finding 800 plus ideas for what could be the standard that you're looking for to actually only 2. So I definitely recommend that you use these search tools we have for finding the right standard. And then, of course, you can always also contact the national standard body if you have any doubts. I can also just show you here that here, for example, you can see this is the current standard. So this is the one that you should be using if you're looking for this standard. It's linked to CE marking. It's again harmonized. And here you will also be able to preview the first 15 pages. So that basically means that if you want to know what is inside this standard, then you will be able to scroll through the first pages and find out, for example, how is this linked to, for example, safety here and this particular regulation. You will also be able to find the table of contents somewhere down here. Here we are. So you'll know, for example, which are the different aspects that are in this standard. You will also be able to find, I'll just go back. Here we are. If you press this blue link, you'll be able to see which is the committee that developed this particular standard. So here you can actually also trace how does this standard come into existence. It was developed by these 2 technical committees. When was it published, and so on. So there's quite a lot of very nice knowledge for you to find if you take a look at this site. Yes, we have a question from Barbara.
Yes, I was wondering how much cross-referencing among standards one should expect.
A lot. I think that's the easiest way to say it. If you open a standard, then there will be a chapter on references. Normative references is the name of the chapter. Here it refers to other standards. So if you look in a standard and you find a chapter called normative references, then you'll be able to see, for example, if you use this standard, then it's recommended you also take a look at these 10 or 5 other standards. So that.
And then the second point, I know you have the survey, so maybe we can address it later on, but I was wondering at the national level, the Standardization Institute, because for the researchers, all this can be very overwhelming and completely new. And even if you find a standard, you might not really be sure if applies to you or not. Some could be too general, some could be too specific, but I don't know how much the specificity is limiting the application of the standards. So do the National Standardization Institute have some support services, all of them for researchers, or just some of them? How's the landscape of support for the researchers?
We have some support. For example, if you have doubt about which could be the relevant standard for me, then you are always welcome to give your standardization body of your country a call, and then they will be able to carry out a search for you about if there, for example, is standardization activities or any standards going on. But I would recommend, if you need further support than that, then we do have what's called HSbooster.eu open calls, where these or your projects can apply. What happens here is that R&I projects can apply to an open call. These are continuously open, so you don't have to aim for a specific time. You can search at any point during your project. We actually often recommend that you can also apply more than once. So you can consider applying in the beginning of your project and get some support, but also later on in your project. There's no limit to how many times you can apply. We do an eligibility check. And eligibility, that is basically looking at, for example, is this a European project? Because we are only giving this advice to European projects and not national ones. So what goes on is that if you apply for this open call, then we will match you with an expert within your field as far as possible, of course, but we will try to find the best expert matching the content of your project or what it is you would like to know. What they can then help you with is they can help you, for example, do a mapping of the standardization landscape. We do also have some training material that you may use. We can also, for example, help with access, because one thing that can also be carried out in these open calls is that, for example, if you apply for this call and you find out, I would like to join one of these technical committees for standardization, it does cost some money to join, but this money can be covered by the HSbooster project if you apply for it. So there is also a little bit of funding. We cannot, unfortunately, fund time, but we can fund the fee. It can also be, for example, what should be my standardization strategy? So that's also something that these experts can help you with. So you are never alone, so to speak, in this. There's always help to find, for example, by applying to these open calls. And it's free of charge. So that means that you can apply and you can get this advice, and it will not cost you anything except the bit of time that you put into it. So if you're thinking, well, all this standardization, it does sound interesting, but it's also a little bit overwhelming, then fear not. We do have experts sitting there awaiting your call, so to speak. So we can help you out in how can you best integrate standardization in your project. So I think we have reached our limited time, but I just wanted to ask if we do have any final questions. Yes, Phil?
Hi there. I just want to check, you were showing us how we could get a preview on the site. Do you actually have to, do you only get the preview if you're logged in?
No, you don't have to be logged in. Yeah.
Okay, because I was just looking for some, say, around fungal materials, and it wasn't actually showing the preview.
No, it should. Was it the Danish site you used?
Yeah.
Well, that's a bit strange because it should show you. If you have any issues with that, you should call the sales department we have. So just a number at the bottom of the page, because they'll be able to give you some technical support, because you should be able to see the preview.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super. Thank you.
Other final questions?
Well, sorry, there was one other, which is, I mean, it's fairly clear about the idea of compliance with existing standards, but you were also talking about how it is that through our R&I, we might actually be contributing towards making standards. And what are the guideline? What's the kind of meta standardization for producing standards? Are there guidelines for that?
Yes, the standard is, of course, standardized. We try to use our own medicine. So if you would like to take part in standardization, first of all, you need to figure out which is the technical committee that I'm interested in, or which is the topic. Again, this is something you can find out by contacting your national standard body, so they can help you with that. Once you then figure out what it is you would like to contribute to, then you can either just listen in, because there can be a very big advantage of knowing beforehand what is going to be standardized, but you can also contribute via these working groups. The only way that you can gain access to these technical committees and working groups is through your national standard body. That's why I've also mentioned these a few times. So, for example, if you are from Spain, then you should contact UNE. If you are from Denmark, you should contact DS, and so on. So you will be able to find out, how do I get access? Because nationally, there will be what we call a mirror committee that can give you access to this standardization work. So you need to contact your national standard body, and then you can help, and they can help you in getting access to the right places.
Super, thank you.
Marie?
Yes, I have a quick question. Thank you, it was very interesting. So it's about the search engine, because so the one that you, sorry if you already mentioned that, but each country have a search engine, but does that allow you to search through the standards overall, or just the ones from the specific countries? Is there a way to look to the database of, you know, international and also specific country?
They should give you access to a search in CEN, CENELEC, ETSI, ISO, IC, ITU often. Okay. Those are the 6 formal standardization organizations. 3 of them are international and 3 of them are European. And then, of course, the particular country, if you would like to see some national standards, then you will go to often the country of origin. I would say many countries, for example, Denmark, we do not have so many national standards anymore. It's very, very limited. Because one of the main elements of developing standards is that we want to reduce barriers to trade, and that can only be done by having the same standards. So most of the standards you'll find in our web shop are European or international.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
So maybe before you wrap up, I just want to remind the projects that you have received a presentation by Signe on the Horizon Standardization Booster. And there you will see also the link that are needed if you want to apply to them. And as she said, this service is free.
Yes. So summing up, what I wanted for you to take away with you today was a little bit, what is actually a standard? What do we mean when talking about standards? How come this is actually relevant for research and innovation? How can I include this in a project? Which are some of the committees that may be relevant for you? And also, how do I then find the right standard? So hopefully that's also what you got out of our little speed talk about standardization today. Like mentioned, we have 2 other webinars, coming up. The next one on the 9th of October is going to be about CE marking. This is, again, of particular importance if you're working with medical devices or robotics or anything that has to be CE marked. I highly recommend that you look into CE marking very early on in the development process, because if you want your product to go to market and it has to be CE marked, then it's I would say it's easier if you make sure that the development follows what you have to live up to in regards to get CE mark. Because if you develop the medical device first and then find out in order to be CE marked, you actually have to change something, it's actually more destructive to the process than if you had considered this from the beginning. So the earlier on you can start looking at CE marking, the better, I would say. And then the third one we have on the 30th of October. Here, we first are going to have someone talking a little bit about LCA in projects, lifecycle assessment. And then we are also going to tell you a little bit about which are the standards that you can use to support your lifecycle assessments in these products that you are developing. So that is what is going to be going on. I will send this presentation to Barbara, and she can then send it on to you. If you have any questions, just contact us. My email is very easy, so it shouldn't be so difficult. So if you have any questions at all, do not hesitate to contact us. We are more than happy to help, because we really think that it is key that we do link research, innovation, and standardization in a better way. So I'm just going to stop my recording. 1 second.